think about how much of our morality is actually just based on access to resources, technology. So yes, and if people might say, oh my God. So here's basically my argument, which is that humans started to think about slavery as a gross and intrinsic wrong when they got the economic capacity to think about that. It's like, it's like going to someone in Pakistan and being like, why do you eat meat? It's wrong to eat meat. They're like, what? Like, what do you mean? Like, I gotta survive. I'm gonna die if I don't eat meat. Like, I'm basically almost, basically barely living as it is. So a lot of these kind of morality about animal ethics and things like that, or eating meat is in kind of a luxury concern, right? Mm-hmm. A luxury concern doesn't mean it's not meaningful. It just means that a lot of people don't have that luxury to think about this as a moral issue. This is a necessity for them. So when human beings got to the point that they no longer needed to exploit the labors of other people to move things and move machines and objects, they could use fossil fuels for this purpose. They were enabled at that point to think about the morality of these things in a more sophisticated way. And that doesn't mean it's like, oh, so you're saying that kind of the evil of slavery is just contingent on technology and economics? I would say, yeah, but that's not so much of a morality is contingent on that. Like that's not demeaning this as a moral issue, because again, from a Muslim perspective, almost every moral issue is based on custom. If it's not prohibited in the Sharia, the Quran, the Sunnah, if it's not required in the Quran and Sunnah, like we actually don't have a right to make a moral absolute claim about things. Things are based on custom. So that's the kind of way out of, I think, the slavery conundrum is to say, you know what? No, slavery is not a gross and intrinsic evil throughout space and time, because a lot of what is right and wrong throughout space and time is based on custom. Now, you could say there's certain types of slavery. You could say, for example, an owner killing their slave. We could say that an owner beating their slave seriously. We could say that an owner not giving their slave enough food, not giving their slave a good accommodation, not giving their slave a chance to worship or a chance to follow their religion, that these are wrong. And as a Muslim, you'd say these are absolutely wrong because this is prohibited by the Quran and the Sunnah, right? Or you could say, like even using natural law reason, you could say it's, for example, wrong to kill a slave or deny a slave the right to their family, kind of using natural law reasoning. And some scholars like Thomas Aquinas did this, died in 1274. But they did not come to the conclusion that slavery itself was wrong, only that certain types of slavery, certain conditions or certain treatment was wrong.
In your book, by the way, talking about Aquinas, a Christian, of course, is that the first Christians that you mentioned who began to argue for the abolition of the institution of slavery were the Quakers. The Quakers, a movement that started in England, very popular.
It's very interesting.
The reason being, of course, that they sat loose to the Bible. They weren't these fundamentalist Christians. They're the people who looked to the spirit rather than the letter. Many of whom, as you rightly say, saw textual problems with the scriptures they have. They've had been corrupted and changed. So that they actually detached themselves from the very Bible. The passage I read from 1 Peter, though, where Peter justifies slavery theologically, they sat loose to this, basically. And that's basically, I think, what happened ultimately with all the churches. They detached themselves from the New Testament, not just on this teaching, but a whole raft. Now on homosexuality, of course, the churches are tending to do exactly the same again. Well, Paul may have said this in Romans, he may have said this in 1 Corinthians 6:9, but we're not going to go there. He was kind of wrong, so we're now going to have a different set of views. I thought this was the New Testament. Well, so this is a progressive kind of disengagement with the teaching of the Bible, the New Testament itself, starting with the Quakers. I think I was very helpful that you pinpointed that movement.
It's very interesting because and one scholar named Christopher Leslie Brown points this out in his book Moral Capital, which is that the earliest pamphlets, kind of writings against slavery that are produced in like the late 1600s and early 1700s in places like Pennsylvania, they come from people who have direct experience with the slave trade. And this is very important because it's not just that there's a kind of economic change and the idea of industrialization and wealth non-slavery based wealth being enabling people to think about slavery as something evil, but it's also the particular slavery they're encountering. So people like Bartholomew de las Casas in the 1500s, people like these figures like George Keith and others in the late 1600s, early 1700s, they know about slavery in Europe and they didn't have a problem with it. Like there's some guy, he's probably from North Africa. He's like carrying your bags from the coach to the house. They're like, yeah, whatever, you know. What they see in the Atlantic slave trade is totally different. Mm-hmm. And this is, and I know it's sort of cliche to say this because we've all seen movies like 12 Years a Slave and Amistad and Roots and things like that. But the violence of the transatlantic slave trade was without precedent in history. I don't know of anything like, I mean, I don't want to say I've read everything about slavery in Islamic civilization, but I've read a lot, primary sources and secondary sources. I've never seen anything like what happened to people when they're taken from West Africa on ships to South America or North America or the Caribbean. And I've never seen anything like what you see in descriptions of slavery on plantations in Jamaica, in South Carolina. It's the level of violence is unbelievable. I'm like a pretty, insensitive person. Like I don't get grossed out by things really that easily. I don't get upset by things that easily. But when I read some of this stuff, there's this guy named Thistledown. I think his name is George Thistledown. I can't remember his first name. He's this British plantation manager and owner in Jamaica. And he kept a diary for decades in which he documents his rape of hundreds of women and his absolute brutalization of people. He would have people, he created a device that would hold your jaw open and he'd make other slaves defecate into that slave's mouth. And then, of course, whipping them to death. I mean, now you have to see why this happens. It's not just these guys are like some kind of psychos or evil. I think they were evil, but that's not the point. The point is there's a huge slave population. In some parts of South Carolina, it was like 90% slaves.
Wow.
And so you had a huge slave population, a very small white overseer population. And they're terrified of slave uprising. So what do? You have to scare the living crap out of these people. You have to terrify them beyond belief with violence. And that's exactly what they did.